Thank you everyone for coming along to this, our third in our series of lockdown talks. And thank you very much to Tom McNeill for offering to give us a talk about mottes and where they sit within castle studies. So without further ado, over to you, Tom.
Okay, right. Unless you're Neil Guy, who holds the record for the number of visits to mott sites in a day, if you take people nowadays to a mott, you have a real problem saying really very much about it, unless it's been excavated or it's got some documentary history. Then even then it's difficult to relate much of the detail to any general narrative story. And your talk really will quickly degenerate down to something on the lines of, this is a very fine mott, bigger than some, smaller than others, an excellent example of its kind. It wasn't always like this. Before the First World War, and shortly after that, when I was a student in the 1960s, in both occasions, motts were the subject of heated debate and even indeed some research and light. But since then, since the 1970s particularly, they've dropped out of the academic agenda. And that, and why they have done this and how we might reinstate them into it is what I want to talk about this evening. You've got on the screen basically some wallpaper to show you various motts, to show you that they exist in all four of the countries of the British Isles. And this was only recognized really in the years of around 1900. It was first in Scotland with Nielsen and Christensen in 1898, established motts were connected to castles. Then in Ireland, Orpin in 1907 published an article which systematically demonstrated that motts were an essential part of early castles in Ireland. And then came Ella Armitage in 1912 in England, who did the same job. Now, both Orpin and Armitage were controversial when they made this claim and established it. In Ireland, many of the motts had been associated with traditional or even legendary and mythical early historical sites. In England, G.T. Clarke had claimed that they were Anglo-Saxon burghs. In both cases, classifying them as Norman or Anglo-Norman sites, in a sense, detracted from their attraction to nationalists. So nationalists rather objected to this demotion of their Anglo-Saxon burgh or their mythical site as simply a castle of an incoming group. But in fact, quite quickly, all three arguments were accepted, and the mott or mott and bailey quickly got into popular parlance. By the 1920s, you can refer to mott and baileys quite easily without having to qualify them. In books on castles that were published then, they always come at the beginning. In the first chapter, along with the beginnings of castles, you get a little chunk on motts and baileys, and then they're quietly forgotten. They've been put in their box and left out and can be kept in it from then on. There were two legacies, though, in fact, of this original research. One was that motts were inextricably linked to external intrusions, and they were also seen as primary or indeed primitive castles. In England, it's 1066 and the Norman conquest. In Scotland, it's David I bringing Anglo-Norman lords into the country in the 1120s. In Ireland, it's the Anglo-Norman invasion after 1168. The second legacy was that all three countries studied their motts separately. There was very little cross-fertilization of ideas people in each country discuss the Mottes of that country alone. So it allowed 3 separate stories really to develop. This didn't really much matter for a long time, but after the Second World War, with the rise of professional medieval archaeology, Mottes came to the fore again. Because if medieval archaeology was going to tackle major subjects, one of the obvious targets was castles, as we can see. And so we get a lot of fieldwork and listing of castles, but above all, not of major stone castles, because they were already well known, but listing and categorizing mottes and baileys, especially in many ways culminating or instigated by Eric Wren's Norman castles in 1967, which remarkably classified baileys by different shapes and so on, and mottes by height. Excavations also started. You got in the early 1950s, you've got Abinger in Surrey and Cloch and Lismachen in County Down in Ulster. All 3 of them excavating the entire top of the mott. Followed on in the late 60s, early 60s, the beginning of the great excavation at Hendommen, where not only a large part of the mott top was excavated, but also mott was cut into and a considerable area of the bailey was excavated. This culminated in the Royal Archaeological Institute project in 1967-68, when Hendommen was supported and joined by excavations at Hastings, Sulgrave, which had already started, and the Bale Hill in York. The idea was, and it was entitled, The Origins of the Castle, the Origins of the Castle in the British Isles project, or in Britain project. And it was followed by a squalid little academic row between Brian Davison on the one hand and Alan Brown on the other, which is a fascinating one to read now because it's redolent of all sorts of class warfare of the 1960s, because you've got the young provincial challenging the establishment professor from London. Brian Davison argued that the conventional wisdom that castles came into England after 1066 as a thing and were imposed as part of the Norman conquest. He pointed out that there was no real clear evidence of what a castle was in Normandy to show that it arrived, and that the evidence for Anglo-Saxon enclosures around lordly sites, in particular the famous Burgiat, the gate tower of Aber around it, could be argued to be castles just as much as anything in Normandy. And therefore, he went on to argue that English society in 1065 was not all that different, or not as different as it had been maintained from Norman society, that the events of 1066 might not have been quite as dramatic as they'd been claimed. Brown got very uptight about this, and he rested his arguments against it, one in 2 ways. One was basically an unproven assertion that castle, knight's fee, and feudalism were all a single package. You couldn't have one without the other. So if you didn't have one, you didn't have the other 2. And he was quite happy that because there wasn't a knight's fee in Anglo-Saxon England, therefore there was no feudalism, therefore there could be no castles, end of story. The second one was, that was a fairly weak argument. It was largely assertion. The other one rested on pomposity, in which he really tried to slap down the young lad who was challenging his superiors. And he went so far as to argue that while historians could use archaeological evidence, archaeologists were not fit to enter into proper historical debate. Luckily for him, he's now dead, which is what happens when you take these lines. What matters from our point of view is both Ian Davison and Alan Brown agreed on a couple of things, some of the key. One was the fact of what seemed to them to be the fact that mottes were really the best way of recognizing an early castle. If it had a motte, it was a castle, and that was easy to do. All the difficulties, for example, about no castles in Normandy was you could not demonstrate at that stage mottes in Normandy before 1066. So castles and early castles, primary castles and mottes got further locked in together. And they also got tied into the idea of a new order. If you had mottes, you had a new order of lordship, a new kind of society was being developed. There were difficulties with this even at the time. Enclosure castles, the so-called ringworks, were an obvious problem, as was the references. What did it mean to a reference to a castle in, say, Normandy, but not in England, the literary side? These were problematic sides, but essentially patted on one side. The major problems really emerged after 1970 with this idea of the primary motte and the idea of the motte as a specific sort of castle, which was another of the legacies of this. That here was a site type of early castle. Therefore, we can study mottes as a single thing. We can take them out of the context of other castles and treat them as a thing by themselves. And this, Cathcart King, for example, in his article in 1970 in Chateauguay, he tries to do this. He tries to classify them again, rather like Alan Brown, about size and distribution. But he comes, very interestingly, his final sentence is that actually the English motte, he says, is a proteus. It takes all sorts of forms, and it really doesn't, I haven't really been able to classify it at all. He didn't go on to draw the obvious conclusion from that it in that case clearly isn't a type. If you can't define it, and if you can't get things that they have in common, for example, all the excavations produced different sorts of buildings. They were different places, different sizes. If you can't really define them as anything more than great big lumps of earth, then really they're pretty unsatisfactory as a type. But he stopped short of that. But otherwise, it's interesting that this was the beginning of this idea, the earlier ideas beginning to unravel. And they unraveled with two particular problems to do with mottes. One, which were and still are connected together, interconnected. One was chronology, not so much the actual dates, but as we'll see, and one was function. The two were, as I say, were linked in together. The chronology was normally done by looking up references in annals, grants of land, or whatever, documentary references, and which might refer either which referred to castles. And then when you went to see them, the castle had a motte. So this was taken to be a reference to the motte. And by and large, it worked. This is how the way, for example, that Orpen established that mottes were castles in 1907. But if we take, for example, if we take the three countries, the chronologies resulting from this documentary evidence produced a different specific pattern. In England, there were three clumps of references. One was to the events of around 1066 and the immediate aftermath, the conqueror founding castles. The second set is in Doomsday in the 1080s, 1086, 87. And the third is the anarchy of 1135 to 54. And after that, by and large, there was an agreement that there were no more mottes built in England. That was it. The book was closed. In Scotland, there were two sets of references, clusters. One was, as we've seen, David I's grants in the 1120s to Anglo-Norman lords. And then the largest number of mottes were to be found in the southwest. And so these were associated with the efforts by the Anglo-Norman lords and the kings of Scotland to overcome the lordships of Galloway, which were a mixed Gaelic and Norse nature. And these were in the 1160s to 1180s. So again, you get a second cluster of mottes being identified. In Ireland, of course, it was dead simple. They all belonged to the conquest after 1169. All these three produced essentially what I would call, and will call for the purposes of this talk, short chronologies. The idea behind them is, and reinforced by the pattern of the documents, that there is an introduction event, if you like. Castles suddenly become introduced, imposed, and built quickly because they're essential to the winning of the new lordships and the establishment of the new lordships. But above all, they're essential to the conquest of new lordships. The trouble about this is, and again, except for David I, you'll see that these are periods linked to warfare. Whether they were linked is another matter. But this ignores and disregards the point that, of course, the documents on which all the dates are based are themselves clumped. They aren't, there isn't a steady number of documents per every one per year. They focus around the big political events. So you've got a positive feedback, if you like. The war produces documents, documents produce mentions of castles, therefore castles are associated with the war and with the time of war. It was good enough at the beginning of study, but it has left, what it did was to reinforce again this idea that mottes and earthwork castles are associated with the beginning of castle building, that they are primary within it. And this, that they belong to a short period. This is what I mean by a short chronology, that they are a sudden event. People come in, there is a furious amount of castle building, and then it drops away. Or the castles become, the motte castles become replaced by stone ones, become proper castles. From the 1990s onwards, we get a number of periods of criticism of this story. You get both general and specific studies. How do I change this down? See, here you get the classic association, of course, Bayer tapestry, war. Here you see two Mottes in war with the knights and so on. But some of the evidence from England that people began looking at from the 1990s onwards, people began looking at individual lordships, at detail of how Mottes were being used, and that they weren't all the idea of the campaign. And you got one side pieces of evidence like this. First on the left, which is from Pound's book, based above all on Derek Wren's thing, you see that the castles of the conquest, these are essentially doomsday castles. There aren't actually, if you look at England as a whole, there aren't actually that many of them. If this was a great big warlike thing, you would expect rather more of them. And they're all, a lot of them, are focused on towns, particularly the royal ones. That was fine and the military thing, but people then began saying, well, perhaps this is an administrative reason, not a military reason. Seizing the towns because that's how Anglo-Saxon England was administered by the king. If we look at the lands of Odo of Bayeux from Richard Ivens's thing, you'll see that by Doomsday, Odo of Bayeux, half-brother of William, had many, you can see how many manors he had, these little dots all over the southeast of England, but only 3 castles, Eddington, Rochester, and one up in East Anglia. Bob Hyam in Devon, early castles in Devon, again, not very many. And certainly not very many early on. Castles, what you get is a picture of castles coming in and steadily growing, being built steadily, not in the short chronology type idea. Instead of a sudden influx, you've got a steady amount. The same with Scotland. Here again, this becomes rather more nuanced. Here, one study of a local one in Flemish settlement in Lanarkshire. You can see that there are Mottes in nearly all the parishes, and they're fine. This is not, and this sets in a way the idea of the Mott as being associated with the organization of landscape and the lordship. But it isn't particularly, these were a series of grants and not conquests. You're back on the 1120s of David bringing in new ideas, new lords and new ideas. But it is curious, if you look at them, how many of the Mottes are not associated with the parish churches. So it looks as though there's something more nuanced going on. And then we have up Richard Oram up in Moray pointing out only some people built Mottes. The incoming people built Mottes, but native lords who still were powerful in Moray did not. Mottes we see here almost as a cultural choice. Some people choose to bring them, to build them, some people didn't. Ireland was the most drastic, if you like, of the revisionism of the role of Mottes here. Because you see Mottes on the left and moated sites on the right. The area of Anglo-Norman settlement, it goes from there up to here. From Shannon estuary up to Ulster. Mottes do not reflect this pattern of settlement at all. Cork has got 2 mottes in it. It's a big county. This area was had strong lordship, English lordships, very few mottes. Quite a lot of moated sites though. And it looks in fact as though the two are almost complementary. You could either build a moated site or you could build a mott. It didn't maybe matter that much. Something of the same as Richard Oram was arguing in Scotland. So what you have here, and this is moves on to a general idea, when you begin putting these stories together, instead of treating them as the stories one country by another, you realize that both the function and the chronologies connected together don't hold, the traditional view doesn't hold well. Most obvious if you take Ireland here, all of these mottes are assumed to date after 1169 on the traditional view, and probably true. If English lords were building mottes in large numbers in Ireland, and we see this going on into the 13th century with men like Archbishop Grey, who is King John's justiciar, constructing mottes. The idea that all mott building in England stopped in 1154 becomes a bit odd. And the same in Scotland lies between it. It's very difficult to see this short burst idea holding in England, and then by definition elsewhere, because they should have died out in use, but clearly they were seen as useful. And Wales, of course, we see exactly the same idea. English lords constructing mottes long after they're supposed to be given up. It also, all of this breaks the link with war. Again, if we take Ireland, if having a mott was an essential thing to your safety, how the heck could these guys down here do without them? They'd have been dead surely the next day if they didn't have a mott, if that was what motts were for. But if motts were like ringworks, moated sites, called which will, simply one way of enhancing your the place of your lordship, another way was an enclosure or whatever, then you begin to understand what they're for. This is what actually they're for. They haven't got this military function. They haven't got this short-term burst of stuff. They are there, we see what they're there for, which is just one way, quick, relatively cheap, of enhancing the status of your site. This, of course, what is the odd part of this in some ways is that this is very much the story of castle studies in general for the last 30 years. Getting away from the idea of militarism, getting away simply to enhance your site and so on. Yet somehow motts got left out of the story. I don't know why, but the easiest way, this is the first way, I think, that we can see how we can reinstate motts back into castle studies. If we accept that motts are like castle, it's simply one of the elements of a castle. And the purpose of the castle is to enhance your caput, and the purpose of the mott is to do it with height. Then this is all very much a story that we see in castles as a whole. We have that this, we abandon the idea of the campaign mott, which is the ultimate military function of the mott. The idea that when you have a small or large army, that you build a campaign, that you come in and you build a campaign fort, a fort in the campaign to protect yourself. mottes are singularly useless for this. The whole point about a mott is that it's tall and has got a restricted top. You couldn't get your horses up there very easily. Without horses, what the heck were the knights to do? Their most valuable part of their campaign is to have horses. What mottes are good for, if they have them in a military function, is exactly the reverse of this. Not an army, a small number of people, giving them a very strongly defended but tight perimeter to defend. But mottes, in fact, are not for the winning of territory, but for the holding of territory, if they have a military function. And this belongs generally, again, with how I think I would see the whole business of castles and early lordships functioning together. Instead of the traditional view that Alan Brown, Cathcart King, and so on, that you erect a castle and from that comes power. I would see it exactly the other way round, that you get a grant, inherit, marry, seize land. First of all, you survey it, you define its boundaries, you list its resources, and then you choose where you want to live and administer it. And once you've decided that, you're caput, then that's where you build a castle. The castle comes after the process of constructing the lordship. And it comes in order to enhance the site as much as any military function. This is all standard stuff for castles in general, but it applies just as much for mott building as well. And of course, the whole form of mottes fits in perfectly well. A mott is simply a tower. It's you see dot pattern, a tower on a rock. Dundonald puts a timber tower on top of an earth mott. It's just a tower on a prominent place, artificially achieved by earth and timber, as opposed to stone and lime. And again, what is a tower for? It is to provide a focal point visible from afar in landscape. It's a place for which you raise a building up so that it is dominant in the countryside or the townscape. And this works well for motts. You get, as I say, you have also, if we see these as just being voluntary choice to build, then the worry that people had in the 1970s, 1980s of what was a wingwork, what was a mott, what was the relationship between the two, falls away. Jack Spurgeon did this splendidly in South Wales when he pointed out that you build a mott where you've got easy land, where you've got the earth is thick enough to dig and pile up, where below the line of the portway, here you build ringworks, here where the soil is thin. Again, you go back to the idea that this is a choice. Motts are just one of the things that you may build in order to enhance your capital. You can enclose it, you can build stone, you can build in earth and timber or whatever. It's almost, you're talking about it being a matter of chance. It's certainly a matter of personal choice. And this, I think, is how we should go on to study the motts as we go into the 21st century. You've got, if we look at individual motts, what can they tell us? Well, first of all, they can tell you about actually how the mott was constructed and earthwork skills that were. Here is what I claim to be the only full excavation of a mott in the British Isles, Dunsilley and County Antrim. in which I took iMac to the Mott, as you can see, and excavated the lot of it. It was, I should point out, a very small Mott, which makes it easy, and it was a Mott that the farmer was going to build and not. But you can see in this part, you can see here an earlier bank of an earlier Rath fort, which was used in part, and here in corresponding side of a basal ring with a layer of stones at the bottom. This we see whenever we do get details preserved. You can see it in the section here. That's that bit. And here are the layers here that you you make a ring and you fill it in. This we find elsewhere in Mottes. You find them in the Mullermeister's work in Belgium. Even Hendomen had the same. Quite common. The basic thing is when you want to make a mound, you've got two structural problems. One is to stop the bottom slipping away, and that's why you put a basal ring, or Bill Woodburn's idea, which would be very economical, of simply gabions of wickerwork barrels of stones set in a ring round the base, just to hold the bottom secure. The second thing, which is performed by these stones up here, is drainage. If the Mott fills with water, if it's very wet, the mound will slump. And so it is important to have drainage levels through, and you can see in the section here, lines of gravel were put in to help with this at Dunsily. And the same we can find out almost certainly. The problem of trying to take this study further is actually, I don't think it's going to be likely that you're going to be allowed to take a HIMAC for Mott ever again. I was lucky. By and large, heritage bodies don't like this sort of treatment of ancient monuments. And it's not also very easy to see how many places you're going to get permission to do it again, or the cash for the hire of machinery and so on. Probing radar is how I would like to do it, but it's proving very difficult to get anybody to do that, but I think we could. The next thing would be the structures on the Mott, what we should look at for the structures on them, study that. This is not really studying the Mott at all. This is just studying the structures of the castle, because the structures, as you can see here, best example is here, Sandal Castle. What they make is a great big tower on the chamber tower for the Lord here, coming down to a grand staircase on his way to the hall and kitchen range here in the bailey. Frankly, the tower up here, you can see there's very little really of it left. There's an awful lot of it left, but not much useful. And there are no rooms, there are no divisions, there's no organization. Can't talk about the organization of space or anything like that in it. And the same applies even more so if the building is of wood. A wooden ground plan is not terribly helpful to work out, to give you information about how the building is used. But above all, you must see this not as the building on top of the Mott, why this building is selected to be the one on top of the Mott. Why, to go back to the earlier one at Cloch, why they put the hall on top of the Mott, along with the chamber on top of the Mott, which is very unusual. Happened at Lismachen nearby. You can really only study the structures on top of the Mott if you know what the structures are in the rest of the castle. It applies, of course, to anything else. There's one thing which I should include, which is the survival of mottes long after they've been constructed as symbols of authority. Here you see at Warwick, when you come into the castle at Warwick, all reconstructed in the 1360s and 70s, the first thing you see is this dirty great old motte in front of you, the symbol of the old earldom of Warwick, still alive and well. Windsor, the motte survived to separate the king's upper guard and the lower ward as well. And it's, in the case of Windsor, I think it's very difficult not to think that the circular motte helped to inspire the circular building for Arthur's round table down when it was found down here. There is another corollary of this, which is not so, I wouldn't follow so easily, which is that the idea has grown that mottes were constructed on prehistoric barrows or Roman sites or whatever, again, symbolically. I think the difficulty there is that you've got a pragmatic alternative. If you've half a motte already, why not just finish it off? Oh, look, a nice mound. Let's make it into a motte without any thought of the symbolism at all. To say in the later Middle Ages, I think they still do demand respect as such. Those are individual motte studies, but I think the main hope of motte studies is really with mottes en masse, with distribution, perhaps distributional studies of either of areas, lordships, counties, something like that. The one big advantage of using mottes in distributional studies is that they're by and large survive well. Mottes are difficult to remove. Before you got Hymax that you could take to Dunsilly or wherever, it took a lot of effort to put them up. It takes a lot of effort to knock them down and level them. In the countryside, this means getting rid of a lot of barren subsoil in order to gain really very little area of profitable land use. It's only really in towns and townscapes that it's much point knocking down a motte to gain the land where land value is high. So survival of mottes should be good. And this gets rid of one of the whole big problems of all distributional studies, which is how representative are they? How much if you see a pattern, how much is that valid, or could it be completely destroyed by filling in the gaps with a couple of destroyed monuments? And large mottes probably don't suffer from that criticism. If you look at the macro scale, you see concentrations of mottes, most obviously along the Welsh borders, but also in southwest Scotland, in parts of Ireland, and so on. You will see it. And this does work well with the old hypothesis. They seem to be areas of low level raiding and conflict, contact zones, conflict zones, proliferate mottes. And that does, I think, which therefore goes back to the idea of the military function. But you can, in here, this is a study of slightly, if you like, more nuanced thing, the mottes of counties Meath and Louth, not Mouth and Leith. Here you've got Meath here and Louth here. Dublin is just down here in Eastern Ireland. This is the there's many mottes here as there aren't many anywhere really in Ireland. And here you can actually, when you look at the structure of lordship, particularly the structure of the lordship of Meath, which we've got some good documentary reasonably good documentary evidence for, you can see that we can actually begin to tease some of these problems out. The main focus of motte building, where you get the densest area of motte building, is in this area here, and in a sort of oblique S along the boundary, the western and northern boundaries of the lordships. And this is where, I think these are 3 kilometer radius circles, and you can see them, this is where they overlap. Well, by and large, none of the rest do. If you take this lot out of the thing and begin examining, there are lots, they seem to have different shapes and sites and so on. You can distinguish them by other features. There are more baileys than in the bulk of them. They are higher. They are closer to rootways. They are not close to parish churches. In all these criteria, you can draw a distinction between this lot of mottes and this lot of mottes. This lot are military ones. So you do have military mottes. They're built along the boundary in the contact zone, exactly as Wales and elsewhere suggests. They're close together because they need to be divisible and connected. They're on the rootways because you want to intercept raiding coming up from up here with the O'Reillys and others raiding down into Meath. You don't hope to intercept them on the way in, you intercept them on the way out for a number of reasons. First of all, they're tired after all the rape and pillage and not up to lifting a battle axe. Secondly, they've got all the loot with them, so you can recover the loot and then claim you never had it. And it's also more predictable. You can assemble people from here along the exit routes. They have to be strong because you don't want them to be on the way in. The baileys are there to protect the horses of the people coming in. What I would envisage is the alarm goes up. People from the, let's say a raid is coming in down this way, here, down into this thing. The people from here, some of them stay to defend their houses. The majority go to these mottes along here to catch the guys coming out again. And they need to the baileys to protect and keep their horses. This means that by corollary, again, these ones are, if these ones are military, then these ones are not military because they're different. And the criteria of distinction relate really to their usefulness in war. And you can see here how the lesser, the mottes here of the larger tenancies have lesser mottes upon them, that you get a cascading down of motte building. First of all, say the Fapo is given the lordship of Duleek. He establishes his caput at Duleek. He leases out subtenancies and they use their capita for their ones too. So if we look at the choices of what they make. When we look at the lordships, we're looking at distributions and putting them into contexts. Contexts either physical or social. Physical context, we've seen the routeways, the resources of the land, and so on. You've seen it, topography again, obviously, as I say, with Spurgeon on mottes, where the landscape is suitable to build mottes. You use them in the borders. If that be the case, as we have seen in Meath and Louth. that the first thing you do is structure lordship. And here we see that one of the first times that mottes were used for this, which was in the lordship of Richmond here. And you can see how the lordship of Richmond had its stone castle, and then there were mottes to the tenancies beyond. Social patterns, if we compare the social patterns, we can see the first, and again from the famous Vale of Montgomery, the mottes along, where is the Vale of Montgomery? Along here, the mottes constructed, that's it, the Vale of Montgomery mottes are these triangles here, which seem to result from an order by the Earl to his tenants to construct mottes, and to do it for either for defense or, again, just because he wanted his lordship to have a lot of mottes in it, would look better, or for whatever reason. Here again, you can see, if you can see these figures here, you can see that in 3 different lordships in Eastern Ireland, you can see how in Leinster, nearly all the mottes are related to tenancies of half a fee or more, half a knight's fee or more. All the other ones have very few mottes on them, the much lower percentage. In Meath and Ulster, by contrast, mottes proliferate far more down the social scale. You get lots more small mottes as well. Leinster, most of the mottes are big, a few of them in the major places. In Ulster and Meath, you get them going down the social scale. So that you can see in here too, there's relatively few castles. This is much more like the Leinster model, Richmond, that studied, that it's the major tenancies that generate castles and not below that. Now, whether that's prohibition, and here again, there's a hint that here the Lord is ordering his lesser tenants to construct mottes. Maybe here he's preventing his lesser tenants from building mottes. Who knows? Or is it, if it's prevention, then here lordship in Meath and Ulster is weaker than it is in Richmond or in the Vale of Montgomery. You can begin to use your mottes both to see the organization of the landscape, the organization of the lordship, and the differences between the various lordships that this implies. There's a shame. And the ultimate, the other side, you can combine the two when you put topography and social patterns together. This, of course, is called settlement patterns. The role of mottes either is generating or reflecting, either causing settlement to be built, or reflecting older settlement, adding the mott to the settlement pattern, which you would like to know. And this leads you on. You get, for example, what I thought you were going to see was a shot of an isolated mott, Ballywalter, in County Antrim. Funny, all my examples are drawn from Ulster. That's the way it goes. Where you've got a mott in apparently completely normal landscape. It has documentary evidence that there was a knight's fee there and a parish. Now, what was there around it physically? Was there a village? Was there a settlement of any sort? Was it purely just the church and the mott in an otherwise empty landscape? That it was purely the administrative centre for town, for urban, for secular and religious lordship, and that's all there was to it. But you get into it. The article that I wrote on Mottes in Ireland at one point used one sentence which said, "This article started with Mottes, but rapidly became as much involved with the pattern of settlement connected to them." That Mottes are a good way of looking in at the construction of lordships, because the one thing that has survived from all of the criticism of the earlier model is we still do see Mottes as belonging to a primary century, at least, of the creation of lordships. They don't belong to en masse to the 14th or 15th centuries. They will may well continue on to the late 12th, early 13th century, but fundamentally they do belong to this first 2, 3, 4 generations of lordship. And this is often a time when we know how lordships begin to be structured. And this, I think, is probably the primary source that, again, we will use Mottes, and the more we use it, of course, that brings Mottes back into the academic agenda. And finally, along this social thing, there is ethnicity. England, by and large, this doesn't apply, but in Wales, in Scotland, and in Ireland, you've got people who are not Anglo-Normans. If Anglo-Normans are a people, they are, but they are not the same. You've got Gaelic Highlands, you've got, as we saw, southwestern Scotland, you've got the Welsh kingdoms and Welsh society, you've got the Irish society. How much and how little they built Mottes poses a question of whether is this because they couldn't? Seems very unlikely. The idea that, for example, that Irish couldn't pile clods of earth one on top of the other when they could build the canals of England seems unlikely. There's no great skill involved. There's no great expense. There's no great craftsmanship. So there's no real material barrier to building castles, to be building mottes, as there might be in stone castles. So is it, when we can see mottes being constructed by non-Anglo-Norman societies, what is this telling us about the structure of their lordship as well? How much they're borrowing from the new income. Conclusions, because it's just after 7 o'clock. Mottes dropped out of the academic agenda in the 1980s, really because research seemed to be getting nowhere. They'd been isolated as a type of castle, partly on their form and the material they have made from, and this wasn't a good basis for research. They were also identified as primary castles, even primitive castles, a line of inquiry which went nowhere, the idea of the origin of castles. And surprisingly, Mottes didn't provide an answer to this question of origin. It's unsurprising because it's an impossible question to answer. Castles evolved from a number of varying social developments of earlier medieval lordship, number of varying physical sites in the past built for lords. There isn't a single origin point. Nobody leapt out of bed or bath or whatever and said, I know what I'm going to do today. I'm going to invent the castle. And did, and patented it, and he made a fortune. This is unlikely. They evolve, and they evolve steadily. And asking for the origin is like asking the question of whether Archaeopteryx was the last dinosaur or the first bird. It is a silly question. Apart from the origin question, study of mottes as a type failed too. The excavations revealed no standard pattern of buildings on them, compressing them into short chronologies, which tied them to the events of conquest or change, broke down. especially as the pattern of motte building across the British Isles as a whole came into play. It was impossible, really, when it came to it, to define what difference the presence of or absence of a motte made to a castle. You couldn't tell it. But to get motte studies on the move again, I think we've got to go back to where the beginnings and what they are. They're earth structures erected to raise buildings up above the rest of the castle and the surrounding land. They were towers, not of stone, but of earth and timber. And that's all. Good call. No more, no less. Unlike stone towers, which preserve above ground foundation levels, will never identify the rooms and spaces of buildings on them. It can tell us, however, of two other different things. If we see them as simply elements of a castle, not as the castle themselves. Firstly, as we say, they shows us the skills and craft of earth moving and carpentry were important. They're important not just in mottes, but in many parts of castles, especially the outer wards, and that continues for a lot longer than the study of simply stone buildings alone. Secondly, they remain in the landscape now to indicate to us sites which their constructed wanted to make prominent. As towers, they were a basic part of the medieval landscape. They might express power and domination, but they might just as well come to mean familiarity and order, like a parish church tower, and as seen in all sorts of Agatha Christie novels. This comfort of the village society. All we have to do is to try and get rid of mottes, the image of mottes that they've had of being primitive proto-castles, only hoping to eat their Weetabix and grow up and become proper castles made of stone. They were part of real castles, and we should learn to study them as that, belonging to a particular phase of castles, certainly, but study them as a whole and learn to love them again. Thank you.